I'm talking to Ken Olisa. He is the Thomson Reuters board member and founding chairman for the Restoration Partners. It's a real pleasure to meet with you and to have you on the show today.
Nice to be here.
So this Congress has been really interesting for me. I think we've had a lot of interesting debate about how to do business. And one of the, you sit offshore, so talk to us a little bit about what Thomson Reuters is doing from the technology space, specifically around communication, because it's one thing looking at data, Ken, but it's another thing when you have a person behind it. So how do we integrate that technology and protect the person on the back, especially with the new reforms that are coming through?
That's an enormous subject, of course.
Yeah.
And you have to look at data and information in all sorts of different categories. So there's kind of generally public stuff. There's then seriously private stuff, and in between the two, you've got the rest. And so understanding that taxonomy is the first challenge. For example, a Thomson Reuters photographer will go into a life-threatening situation to take a photograph. It's public by definition, and then it gets shown to the world. The way you handle that sort of information, making sure it's true and accurate and delivered on time, isn't wildly different from the way you might deal with confidential information, but you need to make sure that you're not confusing the two. And so if you take the taxonomy from public but hugely valuable right the way through to private and hugely valuable, we need to make sure that that data is properly defined. That's a technology challenge, and then there's a human piece on top of that. And some of the great breaches of data security have been because, despite all those great systems, the humans have decided to just ignore the rules or make a mistake.
Absolutely, because you've got an assumption on the back of that, and you've got a sentiment on the back of that, and it boils back down to what is your intent in terms of putting that information out? Because ultimately there is going to be a result in the market based on people's sentiment or view or assumption of what that data means.
Now you're raising a really interesting second question there, which isn't really a technology point now, because and that question is whose business is it to decide how data gets used. Now, in a world of democracies and rule of law and so on, the general theory is it's the people's decision how they deal with it. But obviously, if I don't want my data to be known and it belongs to me, then I don't want that to go wrong. So back to my spectrum point, there has to be a way of managing information down here where the owner of the information has defined the rules for it, right the way to the other end of the spectrum where the owner has no right to stop that information being communicated. It's a non-trivial challenge, and of course we see the world is full of examples of it going badly wrong.
Yes.
By accident, and then going unbelievably wrong by venal activity of people hacking into files and so on. Now, part of that's a technological answer, and increasingly it's a technological answer. So you should be able to say this piece of information can be both encrypted and then labeled so that it cannot be tampered with and it cannot be exposed. And this piece of information, in fact, doesn't matter, and so it's generally open source. But even that carries its problems. If someone's taken a piece of information, let's go with my photography bit. Photographer takes a photograph, it's an amazingly dramatic scene somewhere, then he puts it into Photoshop and makes it much more dramatic and changes it. And then so what is that now? That's not really the basic information, that's a piece of art, I suppose technically, and it's not on my spectrum because it's now been tampered with. So you've got the, how do I protect it in the sense of not being broken into, and then you've got a second order piece, which is how do I make sure that the integrity of the data is protected. And then the third bit, which is the interesting part, which is where we make money, is then how do people use it? And how do you add value with it? How do you create wealth with that kind of information?
And that's the next point, is once you get the people element, how does Thomson Reuters integrate the appetite for that information? So when you see usability, or you see hits on a website, or you see hits on various data pools, what do you do with that information, and how does that drive the strategy around what type of information is relevant?
Well, and again, unfortunately, it's a really complicated question, because at Thomson Reuters, our interests span an enormous spectrum, from intellectual property and science management at one end, or I'm not sure it's an end even, but at one place on this ecosystem, right the way through to the last price for fixed income bond trade in Namibia. So there's all this stuff happening all the time, and the data are all quite different. Obviously, what we're trying to do is either to provide information to machines, which will then do something with that information, obviously hopefully managed by people, or to people. So a way of thinking about it is to imagine a world where you could define all of the origin of information into either being machines, professionals, or amateurs. And then the consumer of the information being either machines, professionals, or amateurs, and there's a nice 3x3 grid there. And then your question, which is a complicated one, can then start to be answered against, is it a machine producing it for an amateur? Is it an amateur producing it to be read by a machine, etc., in that 3x3 grid that I just defined? And then how do you monetize that in a way that preserves the rights of the originators and creates benign value is I guess, our business model.
Well, that's exciting, and I think that I think one of the things that encourages me working with Thomson Reuters a lot is the fact that you have that initiative to drive resource of information, intelligent information, integrous information.
Yes.
That's key. Into a market that the consumer can be in any format. And it's because it matters that the end user does get access to that information. And I encourage you to continue, and it's really, really fantastic to have you on the show. And I look forward to what Thomson Reuters is going to do in the future, because you have some fantastic, fantastic mechanisms.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope we've communicated some information to our readers and listeners today.
And if they don't know, they can always look on your website. They can certainly speak to the individuals at the organization, and people are more than happy to share the knowledge base that you have.
Thank you.